I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacob Berger, and welcome to the first episode of The Examined Life. I'm an attorney by occupation when my kids aren't fighting me for that right, and I enjoy thinking. So I've wanted to start a podcast for a long time, and actually enjoy is a tricky word to use in that scenario, because is there something that you're required to do that can also be classified as enjoyable? If there is, let me know. But this seems to be close to it. So I'm excited to get going. I'm excited to get thinking with you all. And one more disclaimer, I tend to not be very good at quote unquote putting forth my best front. At the end of the day, I'm just a human being. I'm just Jacob. So what you see behind the camera and what I'm seeing on the screen, which is why I'm pointing to it now, is probably pretty close to what you would see if you knew me in real life. And that's the goal of this podcast. That's what I want to do. I want to get comfortable behind the camera so I can offload a lot of the things inside of me that I think could be beneficial to viewers, beneficial to people who are maybe local to me, or who live in the broader geographical area, people who live in the United States, and then just extrapolate that on and on. I think that's everyone who does a podcast. That's everyone's goal in some sense, is to reach people and to increase the sense of connectedness subjectively that I feel. I do think that's a substantial motivator, is just this sense that you want to feel connected. You want to feel like your ideas are malleable and they're intertwined with others. That just makes you feel grounded as a human being. So I know that's a decent motivator for me, but I also think that each person has a unique perspective to offer in the attempt to attain something close to an objective type of truth that people can unify around. And I understand that those are loaded terms, that there's people far smarter than me in many different fields and industries who can ascertain the particulates of those definitions in a more educated and more articulate manner. But that's where I believe I come in and where I'm excited to come in. I think I can do a good job of deriving conclusions from a lot of those highly specialized fields, whether that's in philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, history, mathematics, physics, metaphysics, just anywhere in the political science realm. There's all kinds of conclusions that in their disparate parts seem hard to integrate into your actual existence and improve your existence. But I do think that there is a space that needs to be filled for people who can say, okay, what do all of these growths in the different areas of human existence that we've been undergoing, especially in an accelerated rate, propositionally since the scientific revolution, how do we integrate all these growths into our life and actually allow that to affect change? And that's easier said than done. But I'd like to think that I can communicate some of those truths, small t truths, and incorporate them together and hopefully help illuminate some of the social, political, religious, spiritual, philosophical discourse in a good manner, in a merciful manner, in a manner that adapts humans more towards a position of love and care towards one another, notwithstanding strong and severe and important differences in beliefs. And then I think to cap it all off, I'd like to also use this as a platform for legal analysis. Should that happen? Should there be an instance, for example, the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade a couple months ago? I think there was quite a void for careful, legal, historical, constitutional, political discourse. And I use all those adjectives because it is necessary to be specific, especially when a lot of things are undertaken online and by nature in a purely propositional manner. It's really easy to dehumanize issues. So that's this first episode. I was trying to think of how do I kick off a podcast. It's difficult. But to me, I think one of the most stark issues, and I use that not in the broad sense, which everything is an issue by definition that is discussed and analyzed. I think in the negative sense, one of the issues that I think requires address is our contemporary political discourse, social discourse, just especially online discourse. And I look at a lot of the different figures that you can refer to. I've been a student of this profession or this type of social engagement for quite some time, podcasting. And whether that's, conservative political podcasters, Ben Shapiro, he's the first, Rush Limbaugh, he rest in peace. No, he was, yeah. Brett Cooper is a recent one that I've listened to here and there. And on the other side of the aisle, Pod Save America, there's a legal podcast that I've listened to, Strict Scrutiny, and then obviously the mainstream media outlets, CNN, MSNBC, just Fox News. Everything is catered towards a specific narrative that there is a monetary interest involved, requiring those communicating on those platforms, or at least strongly encouraging those communicating on those platforms, to not have deep human integrity in analyzing issues. There is a predetermined end towards which you're crafting an argument on almost every platform. And one way to get to that argument is to use fallacious means for opposing sides, whether that's straw manning, opposing viewpoints, or just downright focusing on, under certain worldviews, the seeming absurdity of arguments, rather than empathetically approaching things as best as possible from a neutral position first, and then not just from a neutral position, but also trying to do your best to get into the mind of each advocate of each particular nuance in any idea, and attempting from there to find the thread that maybe can connect the sides together. If I use sides as a false dichotomy, obviously there's a multiplicity of perspectives on any one idea. But using a thread to maybe connect those perspectives together. And then from there to say, okay, how can we move forward? Because if there's anything that we do know, is that history is rife. Even our modern era is rife with bloodshed and war and our animalistic tendencies unchecked that have as motivation, I think, and at the beginning, political discourse that is illiterate at worst, and certainly emotionally illiterate. And I could go on and on and on, but I think we all understand where I'm coming from and what I'm getting at when I say the failure to address the necessity to find that thread, I think, can have drastic consequences. So that's what I want to do. I want to look at these issues. I just have this hunger to look at these issues and say, how can I fill this void of connection that we don't seem to have amongst people who all do their best, including myself, to analyze any issue that arises. So hopefully I get better at this as time goes on, but I do think that it'll be fun, and that it will be difficult, but it's necessary. And I gave a couple examples. I name dropped a few, I guess you could say, giants of the intellectual and news industry, or at least where news intersects with intellectual industry. There's plenty of people who don't dabble in politics whatsoever and who are doing incredible things for the intellectual thought space and the advancement of the overall human race through, critical thinking and trying to derive and create better software for our intellect, for our mind. But those types of people that I discussed, if you listen to them, there's really a lack of mercy, I think. And I understand that it's a major disservice to just categorically state a name and then state an issue and say, here is how I'm going to address it, without actually citing two examples. So this is my first podcast, so give me some grace. But I do think that it's quite easy, and it's the low-hanging fruit, to identify, again, the absurdity in an opposing argument when you're approaching it from a particular viewpoint. Say abortion. It's somewhat absurd for someone who doesn't have a religious perspective, who didn't grow up with an ingrained abstract truth, not necessarily grounded in propositional understanding that vested in every human life is inherent meaning, purpose, and divinity. There's a growing percentage of people, almost larger percentage than not, who don't believe, but actually, yes, strictly do not believe unless there's propositional truth underlying it, in anything. And so the value of human life not accepted. So it's quite easy, in some sense, if you do approach the abortion debate the abortion issue from the perspective that there is a divine spark in every human life that is different in substantial kind than any other type of animal life. It's quite easy to just look at the opposing side of the argument and say, you're crazy that you think that killing, murdering a baby is okay just because you want to. And that's commonly what I hear, I think, when it boils down to it. The pro-life position is that I fundamentally, and I use that term in its particular meaning, I fundamentally believe that all human life has meaning. Therefore, from the point of conception, which is the categorical point at which no life to life occurs in the scientific sense, just that the generation of cells that constitute the human being from the and again, that's even debated as to when that happens, but I think you can sufficiently say that prior to conception, that entity doesn't exist. So in the hypothetical example where two people who end up having intercourse and creating a child don't have that intercourse, then at no point ever will that being exist. So in some sense, based on that argument, you can say that being comes into existence upon intercourse of two people. And that creates the life that ultimately will become an adult human being should nothing happen, and then a sentient human being, and then someone who can add to society, and at which point everyone would universally agree that they have rights and that we need to treat them with respect, and you obviously can't kill them just because you want to. So, and I think some of that might be, that comment itself was some of my previous historical understanding of this argument coming out, and that's something that I want to address, is the implicit assumptions that we all make. Little dovetail, but I don't want to let that comment go unaddressed. But it's quite easy to straw man that other argument without understanding that you're coming at it from a particular avenue through which another party won't come at all, because they don't have the same set of principles ingrained in them from childhood. They don't even necessarily look at it the same way. And so how do you integrate the reality that there is two people who can have entirely different experiences? They can be told, this is truth, this is objective truth, this is universal truth. And then another person can be told the very same thing, this is objective universal truth. How do you integrate and how do you thread together those two perspectives? And I think the abortion debate is so good because it's sad that it has to happen. And I think most would agree that it is a sad scenario that it even exists, but such is life, and such is most of life. And that's why most people probably don't even think, because it's sad to think about. But just because it is sad doesn't mean you shouldn't think about it. And it is just such those issues that I think make for great dialect, make for great communication in good faith, to understand, at the core how human beings perceive meaning, perceive value, perceive principles and perspectives. So how do you take some people, a person who has a completely different perspective from someone else, and try to adapt a uniformity such that you can arrive at a conclusion that isn't polarized? And obviously there's all kinds of different ways of compromise, but I believe that pure legal compromise, abstract from societal reconciliation, ultimately won't end well. And history plays this out, and nation states don't last long, and ours certainly seems to be tumultuous at best, and something like the abortion debate is a perfect depiction of that. So I want, coming from a particular angle, just based on my own choice, but how I was raised, I want to demonstrate in this podcast how you can approach something that you fundamentally don't understand growing up, being fed certain truths. And I'm not dismissing the necessity that children get fed truths, because that's what loves them into being, is people who carefully articulate life's truths through their own perspective, tried and true, hopefully, and with humility, so that that child can then become an adult and do the same and be functioning and have a healthy psyche. Because at every layer of this analysis, there are ramifications if you go changing things. So I do understand that. But how do you get someone who had those types of beliefs and it points them to a conclusion, opposed to someone who had completely different that points them to an absolute opposite conclusion? And in good faith, both parties are getting to that place. I think the only way you do it is through merciful empathy and clear articulation of the ideas. And that term articulation is fascinating, because what it means to digest and plumb the depths of a concept and to articulate, just like we have articulates throughout our own physiology. You're identifying the cross points, the tension points where the tendons exist, and you're really crafting the skeleton structure of an idea so you can fully embody it and understand it. And that's possible even if you don't approach the conclusion from the same previous perspective. So how do you do that? It's through this. It's through long-form, honest, good faith discussion, and where you humanize both sides, or all sides, you humanize it, because that's what will permeate, and that's what will pierce through our lizard brain, I think. And in my understanding, that's a good way to live. It's to humanize all sides and say, okay, we've humanized the arguments, now how do we find conclusions? Because someone who, especially in today's state of metaphysics and philosophy, someone who was raised just entirely secular and in an entirely materialistic atmosphere won't look at life the same way. And I think someone who was raised, for example, religious, has this ingrained sense that we're wedded to an objective reality that is outside of ourselves. And there's a lot of cognitive science and philosophical research that's determining, and that thread is all throughout Western metaphysics since the Axial Revolution, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, etc., that meaning is substantiated in the connection between our subjective experience in objective reality. And that's a religious argument to say that it's a faith leap in some sense to trust that everything around you is around you and not subjectively just within you. And that troubles people who are of different constitutions more so than others. It's troubled me deeply, emotionally. The stark, strange, absurd reality that as human beings, we can't get out of our own heads. And everything that we learn is intimately wedded to our own experience. And it's a leap of faith to trust that there is an outside reality set of principles, morals, and values that draw you into a transcendent sense of meaning. But if you don't have that ingrained within you, today's general trend of philosophical thinking is towards nihilism. And it's really easy, to use a technical term in the field of philosophy, to bullshit yourself into finding or forcing into salience things that truly aren't salient. So forcing into your existence focus on aspects of life that might distract you. And again, by you, I mean the non-religious, traditional, more nihilistic thinking individual, that force you into a state of distraction from the strange reality if nihilism is taken to its end, that we're just atomistic individuals that eventually will pass, and we can comprehend that we won't be, but we can't truly know what it is to not be. So that just leaves a huge rift of dank anxiety. But from that place then, because you can't propositionally argue against it, which in some sense I think is the strongest way, propositions, logic, rationalization, to bridge the gap between experiences. Because we can't do that, though, when it isn't a propositional argument that subsists people who believe, fundamentally in the pro-life position, when you can't use propositional arguments to bridge between those gaps, because the propositional argument purely, in some sense, substantiates the nihilistic perspective, which is that there is no deeper meaning, therefore subjective truth is your truth. And I'm not trying to say this dismissively, I understand the merit in this, but if you have a child at a time when you didn't expect to have one, or you don't have one, or the party that you had it with is terrible or doesn't want to stick around, doesn't want to help, as a woman, I totally understand the drive towards, I don't want this and I never wanted this, so I'm not going to have this because of this life, to extrapolate that term beyond just the situation of the child, is all you have, and there's no deeper meaning, there's no deeper value. So it's heavily philosophical. I'm babbling, I understand, but there's no way to propositionally, per se, convince that person out of that perspective. Just like there's not necessarily a way to propositionally convince the fundamentalist outside of their perspective that there is deep meaning in human life. So how do you go about rationalizing, and again I use that term now generally, this discrepancy and hopefully coming to a conclusion if you don't have a way of wedding those perspectives? And I think the way scientifically of wedding those perspectives is to look deeply into the types of knowing that fields of cognitive science have started to recognize as important, which is the propositional, the perspectival, the experiential knowing. And I'm butchering that a little bit, but again, I'm not a cognitive scientist. But it's these other aspects of human beings, these other aspects of truth by which we as human beings experience that truth. It's not all in the purely rational. But that's what conversation online is. It's strictly propositional. And unless you have a video, most of it isn't even face-to-face virtually. Most of it's just written form, which is strictly symbolic and again, constricting highly to just language, which is in of itself just an enhanced way of propositionally communicating. So we're hamstrung by this medium that we're all addicted to, and that we have a terrible time using, and that we have a terrible time using well, and that I feel like very few people apply a high level of intellect to, and also a high level of human compassion and understanding in an attempt to triangulate it towards a higher purpose. So that can be done, and I intend to do that. And I think it's through looking at those people that I identified who reside on polar opposites of the propositional spectrum of conclusions, and in some sense, metaphorically or actually, figuring out how to make long-term eye contact, right? There are ways that we as human beings relate that can begin to transcend even the most deeply held beliefs that we might identify. And if you encourage interhuman relationship, conflict will reduce, and resolutions that are amenable to all parties involved can go up. Not only that, I think, because I would say, I endeavor towards a more meaning-based mindset on life. I understand nihilism. I understand that, I hesitate to say I understand it because that's quite a thing to say. I do my best to understand it. But I also do my best to pursue a sense that life is meaningful. And I just think that works, at least speaking for me, that works well for me. And I have young children, and I have a hard time perceiving how I might raise them should I not adopt a mindset that incorporates a sense of purpose and meaning in life beyond the mere experiential, subjectively experiential. So I understand that I'm more compassionate towards that mindset in some sense. And I say that because in wedding people together relationally, in using mercy when we communicate ideas and differences of opinion, obviously rather than mere compromise, I also want a relational connection. I want relational compromise in tandem with the idyllic compromise. And I think that you can make a strong argument that oftentimes you will move towards a stronger sense of connective, distributed truth. I'm not going to say objective, universal truth, because those terms carry with them intense meanings that require extensive definition. But I do think that the most practicable way to move towards a means of societal understanding of objective truth is to do our best to understand others' experiences and ways that they come about arriving at conclusions. And another example, and I'm about to finish up here, I want to make these about 30 minutes each, I would say. But another example of this is transgender individuals competing in sports in the sex of which they weren't initially. So notwithstanding all the types of experiential arguments that you can make, and all the ways that different people fall on different sides of the spectrum, I think it's similar in that even if there is a conclusion that you hold deeply, that doesn't mean that you should laugh at people who have differing opinion. I strongly believe that. Uh, it doesn't mean that you should, not just laugh, vitriolically communicate or augment the other person towards a dehumanizing metaphor strictly because you don't agree with the way that they're behaving. And whether it's UFC or swimming or disc golf, I tend to be pretty appreciative of events that happen in disc golf as a competitive tournament player myself. But just because you approach it with a certain perspective doesn't mean that you can't learn the practice of taking a step back from your perspective for the sake of collective growth. And I think I'm especially saying this towards people who are maybe more on the conservative end of the perspective. If you do posit that there is ulterior meaning beyond just your own subjective experience, and that there's a deep thread of purpose that runs through life, and that there is a way that we were created, or there is a way that we are to be that is external to our own sense and feelings. If you do posit that, then your end goal should be to incorporate as many people who might have a different opinion into that sense of objectivity. But that doesn't happen with the way that most of the discourse occurs today. It's that's a man out there. That's a big strong. I just want to pretend like I'm a woman and I'll go beat up on some women so I can make money or do this or do that. And honestly, I'm probably not even doing a very good job, because both sides, when they make fun of the other side, I understand it's kind of funny, and I'm not trying to completely delegitimize the entire argument I've been trying to make for the last 30 minutes, but I do think there's a place for humor to some extent, because that is helpful. And I am going to end this with a caveat that balances the need for firm opinions, but going so far as to understand that perhaps the person that you're demonizing is seriously hurting. They feel seriously disenfranchised. They're human just like you. So if you can imagine one of the hardest decisions you've ever made as, say, a free-thinking, strong, independent, masculine man, if you can imagine the hardest decision you ever had to make, you're just a human being like everyone else. The hardest thing you ever went through, it's just like gas that fills a room. Yours might have been thicker than someone else, but everyone experiences their own noxious gas. Doesn't matter how much is released, it will physically fill the entire room. Suffering is like that. And I think it was Frankel who used that analogy. But those individuals who seem to you to be acting in an incredibly absurd and childlike manner responded to an incredibly difficult subjective circumstance in their life. So how can you approach that issue and say, I see you, I understand XYZ that got you to where you're at. Can I have a conversation with you? Can I look you in the eyes? Can I feel your pain? Can I take on your suffering? Do I have the wherewithal to understand that while there might be ramifications to a decision that you've made that differ from my perspective and that I don't like, it is because, in part, of difficulties that you experienced that you made those decisions. So rather than just push back against the decision purely, can I look at you and can I come alongside you and can I just be with you in the difficulty? So again, that's I think an interrelational means to address an issue, but that would at least be the beginning. And this is a kind of an idea in its infancy in my mind. And as I unpack it here, I'm unpacking it internally as well. So I understand that it might seem redundant. But I do think that is how we can address, in some sense, not only the unaddressed, but entirely unidentified issue with our contemporary discourse today. It's that we're all human beings and we all pretty much want the same end, but we're not dying to ourselves and looking at each other and doing our best to transcend the propositional outcomes of different beliefs by experiential knowing of the other person. empathetic knowing, sympathetic knowing of the other person and their difficulties and their perspectives. And I just think a lot could be done to solve that cave, that untouched trove of difficulty with this type of discourse. So that's I think a good picture of how I intend to tackle ideas. And it won't be easy, but I'd like to think that we'll do a good job together. So thank you for listening in. I really enjoy this, and I do think it'll do some good, and I'm open to your thoughts. Comment below. Go ahead and share clips if there's anything that sparked your interest. But follow me along as well on Instagram. Follow my life's journeys to some extent. I'm an avid runner, and I enjoy my weights here and there, and so I think those types of things can be enjoyable to do with other people. So you have a great rest of the day.